This is Two Pastors Talk because we are two pastors who are going to talk. I'm John, and this is my friend Jamie. Um, and today our topic is the gathering, which we will not be able to express like anything close to all of it. But our topic for the day is the gathering. Uh, how does it help us experience the fullness of Christ? What are the elements of the gathering? Kind of how do we do them each, and then why does it matter? And um, I'll start from just kind of my perspective of the big picture. Maybe you can share, and then we can get into some of the elements a little bit more specifically. So for us, or for me, I think about the gathering, and specifically I'm referring to our Sunday gathering. So Sunday church service, whatever we call that. So when I say the gathering, that's the specific of what I'm talking about for this intent and purpose. I think it helps us experience the fullness of Christ in that the church. There was a thumbs up. There it was. The church is the body. The church is the body of Christ. So Christ is the head. The church is the body. We talked a little bit last night about this in a small group. That Christ, because he's been resurrected and is seated at the right hand of the Father, like he's the head of the church, the body. There are things, because he is the head, that I'm going to use the word that he can't do. So we are the hands and feet of Christ. Like we function as the body here on earth. So we join him in his work in bringing about reconciliation between people and God, trying to redeem creation as much as we're able to, all of those kinds of things. And so in the gathering, we are functioning. We help Christ be full, in that now he's merely, I don't use that word lightly, merely a head. We are the body. The elements of our gathering, we look at Acts chapter 2, verses verse 42. I'm going to read it from the NLT. Sure. All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to sharing in meals. The NLT includes a parentheses there that says including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. So we sort of take our cues and the elements of what we do on a Sunday morning from that particular verse. So our elements are so fellowship is not only hi, good to see you. We would say spending time together. Fellowship is, well, we could probably talk about a lot about fellowship. Fellowship is not only hi, good to see you, but it's being together, and we be together. We sing songs together. We pray together. Prayer is one of those pieces from Acts 2:42. We would look at the apostles' teaching. Not that I'm an apostle. We would consider maybe the sermon or the message to be part of that. So we're gonna read and expose scripture for what it is, and then we have an opportunity for people to give. So there's a specified sort of moment, but people now with online giving and all of those kinds of things, I want to make sure I don't miss any elements. So we sing songs. There's an opportunity to give. We read and study the word. We pray, and then we celebrate the Lord's Supper together. So those are the elements of our particular gathering. How we do them, I think it's just what I described. We talked about this a few weeks ago. We do have a liturgy. Every church has a liturgy, whether they call it a liturgy or not. Yep. Our practice is we lead a song. We have someone who gets up and welcomes everyone there, and as part of that, they talk a little bit about giving. In that, we lead two more songs. We have the message time. between the music and the message, those are probably the longest individual elements
How
of.
long, how long do you preach?
um I'm in the I'm like in the 40 to 43 minute
Woo!
space. um we have this timer
Oh no.
that's set at 37 minutes.
Nice,
And
nice.
like we've kind of determined, like, ideally for us, like 37 to 43 minutes is kind of where we want to be.
Yep.
And there are very few 37 minutes.
Yeah.
There are a lot more 42 minutes.
Yeah.
And but we've had 48, 49, 50 plus,
Mhm.
just kind of depending on the topic. um but if someone were to go back, like if anyone in my church ever watches this, they're gonna think that they're gonna love that question that you just asked me. um Honestly, for the series that we've been doing on First Corinthians, it's been more toward the 42-minute
Yeah.
space. So
I would imagine.
we've had a few longer ones,
Mhm.
but that's been pretty rare over the last couple months. Um, so between music and the message time, those are both the longer elements. Um, Sometimes coming out of the message, we have communion, and then we have a song, and then we end with a closing prayer.
Mhm.
Other times coming out of I want to make sure I don't thumbs up. Coming out of the sermon, we'll have a song, maybe like we call, a response, song of response, something like that.
Mhm.
Sometimes we'll have a song and then communion and then our closing prayer. Um, but that's sort of our liturgy
Mhm.
of what that looks like.
And,
Um,
and and the center of that would be the teaching. I think that's probably what the would you say that's I mean, this is and I think we're looking at distinctions between like what we're doing and what you're doing. Like, would that be in your mind? Is the teaching like what is the apex of like a Sunday gathering? I mean, it's hard to. I mean, it's a hard question to answer, and you're because maybe there's multiple ones. I you know.
yeah, I would say somewhere between the message time and communion.
Gotcha.
Like those would
Okay.
be, um and time may or may not be an indicator of which of those two is more important.
Yep.
I would
Yep.
definitely say with the way that we lead music, the goal is to prepare people for what's going to happen in the message time.
Gotcha. There's
And
an intentionality about what you're
yeah,
doing.
yeah.
Gotcha.
And then I would say the coming out of the message time, whether it's music then communion or communion and music, the goal is, there's the intentionality of having the communion piece connected in some way, shape, or form to what we talked about
Gotcha.
in the message.
Gotcha.
So
Gotcha.
yeah, I know exactly what you're asking. Um, and I would say it's between communion and message; those two are, like, that's the thing that we're trying to get people to. If Yeah, if I believe that, I think that answers your question. We're
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
people to be ready to hear, um, the word, and ready to respond. Um, I think communion as not only a response, but a response
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
what they've heard God say to them
Right.
in the
Right.
message time.
Right. Fair
And
enough. That's good.
I'm guessing that's probably not dissimilar from what your evangelical background was.
No, no. I mean, how often do you guys do communion? I can't
We
remember. You told me
we celebrate weekly.
every week. Okay, and which makes good sense. And we only did it. My evangelical background with the CMA was once, and I don't know if there was a strict rule about this or not, but it was one. We only did it once a month. I think we did it. I want to say either the first or last Sunday of the month,
Mm,
and it was the last portion. Like it was like the service was in essence done, and we would. I don't mean this negatively, but we would tack on to that. And my
mm,
dad, growing up with my dad as a pastor, it's actually probably the thing I most remember and most enjoy from that period of my life. which is weird because I probably the time I didn't take it. I
Mhm,
mean, I took it seriously, but I don't think I would have thought of it that way. But now I look back, I'm like, yeah, that was probably the most formative,
mhm.
communion. So yeah,
Yeah, you tack it on.
I mean, it sounds weird to say it that way. It doesn't, because it
No,
was like we're tacked on to the end, But it
yeah.
was neat, I think we saw it as something that I think at the time. Now, as an Orthodox person, I see it very differently, but we knew it was something you're supposed to do.
Mhm,
So it was, merged sort of into the end of the service, and it wasn't rushed. Like as I recall, with my dad, he had actually sort of, it was very liturgical, like very liturgical. Like he had a little, essentially without knowing it, he had created. I never saw any other pastors do this, but he had created a little sort of service
mhm.
of communion. That was it merged nicely with the service, but it was its own little thing. It's very, I mean, it's interesting looking back on it. It's different.
Yeah.
We have a different perspective, but
Yeah, and we we effort we effort not having it, not giving it that tack it on feel.
yep.
We communicate. So each of the people who are going to do our communion meditation on a weekly basis, they know what text we're going to preach the following Sunday.
hmm
They'll have a summary of what the
Yep.
sermon's going to be. I haven't done this in a while just because I've changed the way I do my sermon prep. But there have been times in the past where they've seen a message flow, like
hmm
3 to 5 sentences of where we're starting and where this is going to end up, which really has helped them to develop their, it's not sermon 2.0,
Yeah.
um, but to help them
Yep.
kind of develop what their thoughts going to be for the meditation. Sometimes there's a moment of silence. Sometimes it just really is um, up to the person who's leading the meditation. We give them freedom to be able to do that, within some guide. I mean, we desire it to, obviously to be honoring to what God, not taking it in an
hmm
inappropriate way from First Corinthians 11. Um, but we try to not have it be that, like, we don't want anything to feel like this is tacked on, where there's just a lot of purpose and intentionality, and that's probably something that makes up a great liturgy. Not
Yep.
that we have a great liturgy, but that would make up a great liturgy in my mind of intentionality and purpose and flow and all of those kinds of things.
You want me to talk about mine now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to think this through. I mean, it's interesting when you bring up Acts. In the Greek, that last word, Acts 2:42. The last word is breaking of bread, and in your transitions in prayer, gathering
Mm-hmm.
in prayer, but in the Greek, it's, as I understand, it's plural. So it's interesting from our perspective
Mm,
as Orthodox. That's an indication of some specific, like the specific. Um, Double check it for me. I'm looking at the old Orthodox Study Bible here. Um, and they have a footnote on it too, particularly about that. But the idea being, at least from our understanding, a connection to the prayers that they would have done, and the practice of Judaism,
mm-hmm.
regular daily prayers, a format of prayers that would have been done. And so they were gathering together, they were doing regular prayers, in the sense, like we would say, I think from the Orthodox perspective, we would say fixed prayers of the church. So
Okay.
these are given to us. Like, I don't have my service book in front of me, but I have a service book I serve from, and those prayers, it's a book full of prayers.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, it's one long prayer. It's fixed. It's prescribed for certain things to be done at certain times. So that gathering, from our perspective, like we would apply that in terms of how we do our services. So I'm trying to think of things that I would want to I'd want to put at the forefront of this. Like, first of all, for us, um, the Eucharist, partaking of communion, is the central act of worship, realizing that worship is twofold. There's two aspects of worship. There's worship that's given to things that are deserving of honor but are not God, when there are things that are only that's only honor, given to God. So there's two Greek words for that. We won't get into that from the Orthodox perspective, which is why we have icons, which is why we have saints. But how we differentiate between what we're doing with them and what we're doing with God. God only gets certain things, and in our English language and in the Western mind, we tend to just put everything under the one box, and then get upset when people seem to be doing things that don't fit. But the Orthodox is two different things. So that's one thing. The Eucharist itself, from our perspective, of course, is we take very literally the Gospel of John, the body and blood of Christ. How that works, it's a mystery. A lot of people, I know people have issues with it, and they'll make derogatory comments about it. I get it. I was there. I don't ascribe to that anymore as an Orthodox. I believe that's the truth. So if that's the truth about it, and communion, the Eucharist, is like the highest form of worship, the highest form of interaction of us with Christ, then it deserves the greatest amount of preparation,
Mm.
and also too the greatest amount of beauty, or like given to the act of receiving it. So you've been to a liturgy when I was in seminary, and you saw how it's like a spiral staircase. It sort of goes around. You kind of go back to places you've been before, but you're not in the same place anymore, and it reaches an apex, and then you descend rather quickly from it, and you end the service. So it's not linear. It's more circular, but kind of climbing and then descending, and you're done. Or actually, you're actually moving into something else. So, all right. So getting into we're talking about the elements of the service. That's what we're
Yeah.
there's two major elements for us on Sunday. So we have services all the time, but the Sunday service, which the Eucharistic service on Sunday, like I said, multiple services happening essentially on Sunday. Vespers, matins, the hours, things like that are happening. But the Divine Liturgy is the preeminent service. It's the Eucharistic service. It's where we are doing the thing that, in a sense, you might say produces the communion, the Eucharist, and it's in two parts. And the first major part is we call it the liturgy of the Word. So that's the part that begins the service, and it leads us to the reading of the gospel. So we have a number of hymns that are sung called antiphons. They're supposed to be sung back and forth by two different choirs, but usually it's just one choir, all a cappella. The priest and the choir, or the deacon and the choir, are chanting back and forth. It's all sung, everything's sung or chanted. And then it leads to a point at which you see the priest bring in, or priest and deacon bring in, a big book. It's the gospel book. It's the four gospels. So it's basically saying we're starting the service. We've done all this stuff to lead up to it. Now we're starting the service. I say bringing in the priest. I mean, you have to kind of be in an Orthodox church, but he takes a book, the gospel book, and he brings it into the altar space to say, here we are. This is Christ revealed in word form. We're putting him on the altar, like his throne. He's enthroned in the form of a book, in a way, in words. So that begins that part. And so from that part, we end up reading a reading from every week, at least one reading from an epistle, and at least one reading from one of the four gospels, and it kind of flows through the year. There's an order to it. When that's done, the priest or a person who's been given a blessing to preaches. That's why I asked you, because like I tend to preach long in Orthodox terms, and long is like 15 to 20 minutes, which is so funny to me because I grew up with my dad preaching like 45 minutes, an hour and 15. Then the Orthodoxy, it's like 15. I mean, literally, they're priests who, if they're good, they can preach a 5-minute sermon and do the same work as a 45-minute sermon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not good. So we preach, and that's the first half, in a sense, of the service, the element of the word, so the liturgy of the word. Then after that, the service sort of begins again. Sort of. We kind of pick up where we paused. And at that point, it begins what we call the liturgy of the faithful. And to be a member of the faithful means that you are a person who can take communion that day. There are people who maybe haven't, we were talking about confession before all this started. There may be people who are not, because they have not done the things we say they need to do in order to prepare to receive communion, because we take it really seriously. We fast from midnight from food, from midnight until we receive communion, so we can prepare our bodies physically. We think that's important. If someone's sickly, they can't do that. They just eat, someone's got diabetes, they better eat,
Mm-hmm.
But for those who are healthy, we fast. We prepare ourselves in other ways that way too. And also too, we talked about confession, like regularly going to the priest, dealing with our sins, asking Christ through the priest, because Christ chooses to work through his people, like we were saying earlier. He works, he's the head, but his choice is to work through us.
Yeah.
So in that way, there's that synergy. I would use that very Orthodox term between God and man. So we prepare for that. So we start the liturgy of the faithful, and that's got a number of pieces in it. Prayers that we do what's called litanies, like series of prayers for the whole world, for everybody. and then prayers that are geared where we enter in like the names of the people in our community who need prayer. So sick people, people who are having babies, we pray for people who've passed away because the soul is still alive. It's with God. So we just pray for the people. We don't think twice about that. So that leads us all the way forward to the point where like all of this is sort of like it's a long path, and it's also like it's gilded. It's like we talked about that before too. Trying to make this thing elaborate, not for the sake of elaboration, but to place emphasis on what we're doing. Like you've got time to walk away from this if you need to walk away from this.
Mm.
Realize like the gates of heaven aren't just like a wooden gate. It's like this idea of like this is serious what we do. So we take we go through these various stages. We sing certain hymns regularly. We sing the Lord's Prayer. We sing the Creed, the Nicene Creed. For us that's important because it's a statement of what we believe. um I'm not doing this quite in order. And then we get to the point where basically we've already earlier on dismissed the people, technically dismissed the ones who can't take communion, and technically they would go to the back of the church because they
Okay.
wouldn't. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So as you're going through this process and doing these
Mhm.
different things, what I'm hearing you say is for those who aren't going to participate for whatever reason, they are hey, look at that.
That's awesome.
Golly, I need to
That's
turn that
awesome.
off. That's
I
the
love it. I
worst.
love it. I love it.
um, I got to figure that out. Um, they they're essentially what it sounds like you're saying to me is they are doing the work of evaluating themselves,
Yeah.
and they're determining that they're not going to take communion that day. So
Yeah.
their space is to go to the back and be like, yeah, I'm not going to do this today for whatever reason. So
Yeah. And
so that process of prayers and music and all of those kinds of things, you are counting on through those elements the spirit to do the work in the person's heart, where they're going to be self-checking that.
to some degree, to
Okay.
some degree, because one of the this is where accountability between a pastor and we were talking about confession again before this. Accountability between the pastor and the people in his flock. I've had to tell people before, sometimes they'll refrain from coming to communion, but they haven't talked to me about it. Like,
Mm,
so maybe they haven't prepared themselves properly that day. Maybe they just chose to eat breakfast and they didn't need to eat breakfast and they shouldn't have done that before church, and they did that and they didn't fast properly. And at which point I would say that's okay, that's fine, but it does deserve some discussion. Like, why did that happen? Could you have, like, I've been doing this for a lot of years. I don't even think about breakfast on Sunday anymore. It doesn't even matter to me. Um, it's not like it's hard to do. So, if that's happening, then it should be something that the pastor talks to the person about. But there are times when people will say, I wasn't prepared today.
mm,
But ideally, they're not going to not come to communion unless the priest says, look, you might need to step away from this. Because most of the time what really needs to happen is we just need to come to communion. We're never worthy.
mm,
Christ makes us worthy. So it's not about doing some work to prove to God you're good enough to take communion. It's more that are you in a place where you can receive what we would call like the fiery coal? You think about Isaiah and how the angel takes the tongs of the coal and puts it on his tongue. For us, that's what communion is. It's the fiery coal of Christ being put on your tongue. So if you're not in a place to receive, you might have to step back. So that's that period where people either they know already, like for instance, people who can't receive communion, namely people who aren't Orthodox but are becoming Orthodox, and they know they can't. They would technically, we don't always do this in our parishes, but they would remove themselves to the back of the church physically. That way, it's sort of like an physical act of humility. No one's going to push them back there. I'm not going to do it, but they can do that themselves. And then those who are going to receive, we say to them, basically draw near. So they come up and they receive communion later. So that happens towards the end of the service. That's the
mhm.
apex for us. So we've heard the thing I would want to stress in a minute or two I should put into this is we have the sort of the first peak which is the proclamation of the gospel. Okay. So a section of the gospel reading, a section from, we're in Luke right now, that's read, and you hear that. And so you, in a sense, commune by way of ear in that sense. And that's supposed to be connected to the other part of the service, which would be the Eucharist, where you commune by mouth. So in both, you're receiving Christ by way of the ear, and then we would say also you receive Christ by way of communion, which joins us all together. That's the idea of communion, community, communion being brought together, but also to us, it's a sacrament. Somehow God uses the things of the world that he created to save us. That's our perspective. And after that's done, it's really kind of quick for us. After that's done, we have a couple more prayers, a couple more hymns, and eventually a dismissal. It's sort of like brings us to a conclusion, and then we finish, and then we usually stop and we have a meal together afterwards. We've all been fasting. I mean, that's not a very good. I'm not summarizing the liturgy very well.
No, I think you did.
Okay.
I think for this, I think that's
for the sake of this.
So what? It's funny. I was gonna ask a question about preaching, which really answers your question of what the apex is.
Yeah.
like regardless of everything I just said.
I think mentally, from the evangelical perspective, the difference is because this is my experience. It's part of I think part of why I converted too. It's not bad. I mean, we're supposed to preach the word. I think what's happened, I know what's happened, because when the sacramental thinking post Reformation began to drop lower and lower, that's where I would say, well, let's just say drifted in a different direction rather than saying lower, because that sort of feels more negative than it needs to be. That it drifted into a different direction, then the preaching had to rise, because that becomes the focus. And it's good. We need to hear the word, and the word needs to be explained so people can live the word. But there's that side, we would say, as Orthodox, we would say, because we have such a high view of creation as God's means to save us, because that's what he comes into creation. I'm trying not to preach here, John, but he comes into creation, he takes on matter, and by taking on matter, we would say he shows that matter is good. And so using matter, things like obviously like the cross, his own body, and then we would say now, he institutes a way for us to partake of that through bread and wine. So for us, it's wine. So it's like this, it's a difference in emphasis. The question from the Orthodox perspective, for the evangelical perspective, would be, is there a way to, like, we have very definite ideas about it, but for this conversation, we would look at it and say, is there a way for that to be recovered, or is it just simply something that's not needed to be recovered? I don't know, that's, I'm trying, because we're not debating, we're just talking, So Orthodox people watching me might be like, why is he not like going for the jugular? And I'm like, I don't, that's not the point of this. We're friends. We're just talking.
Right. I'm thinking of communion, and so this past week, as a for instance, so I know this is going to air. This is going to be on YouTube long after what I'm about to say. We're currently going through 1 Corinthians.
Right.
And the text that I preached on this past week was 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1-5. And it's the part where Paul talks about he and Apollos are servants. They've been placed in charge of something. And then he says, as for me, it matters very little how I might be evaluated by you or any other human authority. So there's this concept of evaluation. And then he goes on to say next, and NLT again, I don't even trust my own judgment on this point. My conscience is clear, but that doesn't mean I'm square with God, basically.
Yeah.
And one of our elders then, after the message, when he went up to talk about communion, he talked about this evaluation, and he he connected it to in 1 Corinthians 11 when Paul writes essentially, hey, before you take communion, you are to evaluate yourself.
Yeah.
So he talked about the tent, like why in one place is Paul saying I don't evaluate myself, and then elsewhere in the same letter he's talking about what it means to evaluate yourself. So there is an element for us of, we do talk about that evaluation, but I'm not keeping track of, I'm not looking around me and seeing who is or who isn't
Mm,
participating in communion.
yeah. Yep. Yep.
um is and I'm sure I really minimized just the way, and not, I'm sure I really reduced what's happening in that Eucharist service. Um, do you have you told, like, at some point, do you tell the people as we're leading up to Eucharist, like all of these elements are geared to help you think that way? Are you living in expectation that they're going to figure that out on their own? What does that process look like? Whereas for like our elder that got up and spoke on Sunday, he flat out said, look, this is what it means. And then he used an example. He said, if you're sitting on your phone playing games during our, like, doing what we're doing, that's probably eating and drinking in an unworthy manner. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah.
probably a great
Yep.
definition of that.
Yep.
Um, is that something, but that's like a direct, we're calling this situation out. Is that something that you do? Is that something that you're counting on the liturgy to draw that out of people, of being maybe not explicit, but it's implicitly going to be drawn out? How do you communicate, that?
Both ways, like you said. I mean, the liturgy itself is supposed to, ideally, it's supposed to really communicate a sense of awe.
Mm.
In our services, as you saw, like traditionally we stand. If you get tired, you can sit in a seat, but we don't have pews. Well, some churches do, but we don't. Many Orthodox churches don't. And you stand. The idea is, you're standing in the presence of God to worship. And those who are older, they sit. Those who are young, they sit. Normal, healthy people sometimes sit. So, excuse me, in some ways, the service is supposed to do that. That's not, another thought had come to me as I was saying that too. I was trying to think through how I'd want to communicate that. Boy, it was a good thought too for a second there. But I also do directly say, like, really, like, we talk about things like you can do a lot of things and still sort of come to the chalice. We have a chalice, and a spoon, and we spoon out individually to each person the same spoon that, we take the portion of the wine and the bread. It goes to, it's different. It's different than anything else anybody else seems to do. And I tell people, like, this is, number one, we're terrible judges of whether or not we are worthy or not.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. And so a lot of times we can err in both extremes. So I tell people, don't not come unless I tell you to not come, unless something's different. And don't come if you're not ready for this. I mean, it's a big deal. I tell people, when you're in the line to come up and receive communion, because we come through one at a time, and the priest puts it in each person's mouth. Like, don't chat. It's not time to chat. It was famous in ancient times when St. John Chrysostom was the patriarch of it was Constantinople, and I assume he served in Hagia Sophia. That's my understanding of history. And Hagia Sophia is this massive, huge church, and all kinds of chicanery was going on in the church. And there's a point at which in the service where today, I think in Latin it's called the Sursum Corda. It's a part of the service where the priest turns around. We don't do Latin, but that's what it's called. The priest will turn to the people. He'll say something to the people. Then we always face with the people towards the altar. He turns back, he lifts up his hands. He says, let us lift up our hearts, which is basically a holy shut up and stop talking and listen up. Because people are back at the back, when they should be paying attention to the service. It's very easy in our services, in a sense, because the choir is doing the hard work. You're supposed to be joining in with that, praying with them. But oftentimes people just come, they become passive observers at best. And so there have been priests, I know of, like, great priests of our church who stopped the liturgy and turned around and said, calm down. pay attention, stop doing the craziness you're doing. Now, I've never had to do that, but it happens. But I will directly say to people, and Sunday even I had to give a little, like right before communion, I sometimes will stop and I'll come out and I'll talk to everybody very, very briefly about what we're about to do, especially if we have visitors who don't know. If I don't recognize you, I'll say, tell me who you are. I can't commune you if you're not Orthodox.
Mm.
I can't commune you if you're not in good standing with your own priest in this term. So there are those moments where we have to be very direct about it. And we're very as Orthodox priests, we would be very protective of two things. First of all, of the Eucharist, because we believe, like, we don't, when we're done, I remember in the old days when I was an evangelical, when we were, I don't know what you do. Well, you guys don't have to do this because you use the
Right.
disposable cups. We had the tray, with all the juice in all of them, and then we had the tray with all the bread on them. Well, when we were done with it, we would just take it to the sink and pour out the stuff we didn't use, or pour it back into a bottle, but oftentimes just pour out the grape juice. And whatever bread was left, oftentimes just went into the trash. For the Orthodox, it's like, doesn't work that way at all. When we're done with communion, whatever remains in the chalice is consumed by the priest totally. Nothing gets thrown away, so it's consumed. So we're very protective of it. So we're protecting, in a sense, the honor of this thing, this bread and this wine that we say has not just greater significance, but is something greater than it appears to our, mortal eyes, you might say, which is Christ. But on the other hand, we want to protect the people so that they're not harming themselves, as St. Paul would say, receiving unworthily.
Yeah.
So we do instruct, and the service itself should over time, if you got your eyes open, will teach you everything you need to know. But it takes a lot of times, it takes people a long time because they're not really paying attention. They have to learn.
Right.
So does that make sense? Is that clear?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I didn't get a thumbs up, so I wasn't sure.
Oh, or fireworks.
Or fireworks. I don't think it does thumbs up on my side, does it? It doesn't. All right. I got
to figure out how to turn that off. Yeah, because we practice, like, and this is something else that our elder said, we practice open communion. So if you're a follower of Christ, this is for you.
Yeah.
And obviously there's tension in that of if you're evaluating yourself and you're doing it in an unworthy manner. I really liked what you said, and I want to come back to and do a lengthier one on confession a little bit.
It's fun. I like talking about that.
Of you said something to the effect of you're probably not as, like, you're not as good of a sinner as you think you are. And I think that's really good, because people can really be hard on themselves. And we want to help them through that. So at some point, I think, coming back to confession, and I like the way when we were doing this before, you tied that to accountability partner. Like that's something that just really resonates.
When we talk about it, we'll talk about that in terms of, like, the difference would be sacramental. So we would say there's something, at some point we have to talk about what it means to have a sacramental point of view on things and not. But, like, the flip side of that too is, just as the brief, since you brought it up, like, when we talk about you're not as good of a sinner as you think you are, it's just another form of pride. We can be proud of our sins, so you have to be very careful with all that.
So one thing you said also a minute ago was, if you see that there are new people there, you are part of your role is to I would say part of your role is to introduce them to whatever that particular church culture is. And that's certainly something, like, when I think about all of our different elements, and, like, we have a welcome where we talk about giving, and communion where we're trying to, one of the things that we try to do is introduce those instructives into the thing that we're doing, that can help people along, help people just navigate that liturgy. So I'm glad that we're not the only ones that do that, because we have our church tradition here at Westway is Restoration movement, so a couple hundred years old. And we probably have, if I were going to throw a percentage out, there's probably, this may not be very generous, but
Mhm.
there's probably 30% of the people in our body who really have any clue as to what
Yeah,
that means.
yeah,
Because most of them are like me, having come from a number of different church backgrounds
yep,
and don't really have a frame of reference for, like, why do we take communion every week? So
yep,
we've worked with the people who give our meditations, like, every once in a while you maybe should throw that in there. this,
yep,
this is this
yeah,
is this is why we're doing this is why we do
yep.
this every week.
Don't
This is
assume.
what that looks
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
and stuff like that. So, well, cool. Well, I think I would like, because my real answer of what matters most is sermon. I like this. This is good. It's humble. This is a very humbling conversation.
I was
Uh,
trying not pointing at you either. By the way, I was
no,
more curious to see how long you preached.
no, I think, we don't we don't know what our we don't. That's why it's called a blind spot.
Yeah. Hmm.
Because we don't, the things that we, our secret values are, there are real values. So I I would I would like to talk more about, um, the message part, especially, you
Yeah.
said you bring out the word, and there's or the gospel, and then there's an
Mhm.
epistle connection.
Yep.
I would like to explore more, of the message part, because I'm curious about what that
Sure.
looks like. I know what our situation is. I know what I do, but I am curious more about the message part. Several couple months ago, when I communicated on Facebook that I was reading The Lord of the Rings, your Katie posted something about, I think it was Katie,
Yeah, it probably
like
was.
how she how you constantly use The Lord of the Rings, um
I've cut
references.
back.
So I like, but that sort of propels my interest in
Hmm.
in the message part of what that
Hmm.
looks like for you. Um so I maybe that's a next topic of
Yeah.
what does that look like. But I do want to talk more about confession at some point.
Okay.
um so that's kind of an overview um of the gathering. In I know we just have a couple minutes left. Why does what would you how would you answer the question, why does the gathering matter?
Well, I think there's two aspects. It would be a long answer, but I think in brief, I think first of all, it's a command that we gather
Mm,
for. We can't. We're not. No Christian is a Christian alone. It's
yeah.
not how it works. So it's always about we're being saved into Christ,
Mm,
and that Christ is a
mm,
body.
mm, mm,
So gathering is super, super important. It's practically important because you need the encouragement of other people. Although coming to church sometimes can be, like we always say, liturgy is work. I mean, coming on Sunday, it's hard sometimes because not everybody's, in our context yet, not everybody's like always pleasant. People have their problems. They come in, but that's also good because then we can minister. So that's another aspect. We hear the word of God spoken to us. Maybe we
mm,
didn't even read the Bible that week,
mm.
but it's going to happen at church and you're going to
Yeah.
hear not just the gospel, but at least in a divine liturgy. If you listen to the whole thing, there's like 300 scripture references throughout the whole thing. It's
Mm,
long, there's lots of
mm,
them. And then at the end of it all, you're receiving, the life through the Eucharist, through Christ himself, in our perspective, that you cannot do in any other way. There's no
mm,
other way to do this but through the ministration of the church. It's not that the church is clamping down to control it. It becomes the fountain. You can only get things from a fountain if you go to a fountain.
mm,
So all those aspects of it are in there, the community. And then after all that is fellowship, putting to practice when we sit down to eat a meal together after church, what we should have learned, in the liturgy, peace, being at peace with one another, forgiving one another, loving one another, helping to feed one another, and then beyond that, helping people beyond the doors of our church too. So that's,
mhm,
I mean, you can go in your boat and you can worship God. You can do that. It's doable, but it's not the same thing as coming to church, gathering with the people, worshiping God in song, worshiping Him through our actions, we would say receiving communion, receiving the Eucharist, and then having been changed, ideally been changed, or whether we were like massive theologians or just kids in the faith still, having been changed, taking that out into the world,
Yeah.
and changing the world.
Mhm. Yeah.
Good
And
topic.
I would say what I like that you started with the command. Um,
Yeah.
and definitely like it's our it's our opportunity to demonstrate to demonstrate the realities of the impact of Christ with one another.
Yeah.
And we can only do that. We can only do that when we're surrounded by other believers.
Yeah. We need that.
Edification, building up the body. So my bias, I'll bring my bias up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Edification, through the reading and the interaction and the hearing of the spoken word, builds us up as a body. And then for people who maybe aren't Christians, coming into that and hopefully introducing them into a culture of what it means to be a follower of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they can see that demonstrated in our space. And this is something I try and tell our people all the time. Um, if people come into our space and they don't see us faithfully demonstrating Christ, they're never going to come here. Like they're never
Yeah.
going to come back if we're
Yeah.
not living that truth out.
My sermon last Sunday, I said, if I said something similar too, that if we're not going to live that life, then may God shut our church down. We don't need to be, we don't need to add to darkness. If we're not going to do the thing that we need to do, then we need to stop doing what we're doing and let someone else take over for us. My belief is our church is doing it, but it's better for us. We have to realize those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, this is Two Pastors Talk, and we will see you again soon with another wonderful topic of discussion between two pastors of similar backgrounds and yet now completely different traditions, which is awesome. That's the body, right? Not everyone's an eye. So yeah, this is cool. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to us today, and we will talk to you again soon.